First of all, if you don't mind, I would like to start with the history, because in April 2008, I was in Bucharest at the summit as a young reporter at the summit, which became like very important. And there was a big discussion about membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. You remember it perfectly well. And the decision was not to provide Georgia and Ukraine with this plan. Do you regret about that decision?
Very much so, although, of course, I defended it as NATO Secretary General, but I have been out in public many times after 2008. This was not the right compromise, because we left Ukraine in a gray zone in Europe. And in the words of my American friend Kurt Volker, who was NATO ambassador and special representative for Ukraine, gray zones mean green light. So we gave Vladimir Putin reason to use the instability which was created in Bucharest. So, and you remember, because you were there, it was a big fight between President George W. Bush on the one hand and the German Chancellor Merkel and the French then President Sarkozy on the other hand. And compromise is compromise, but it was an ugly compromise.
Who is responsible, if we can talk about that right now? Is Chancellor Merkel and President Sarkozy responsible for this final decision, or maybe there were other parties as well? How was this, conversation going on? Because I remember that decision was made in the middle of the night, if I'm not wrong.
And if you ask for responsibility, it was a collective responsibility of the NATO allies, because they all signed up for the compromise at the end of the day, or I should rather say at the end of the night. And we promised Ukraine and Georgia, we promised Ukraine something on which we knew we could not deliver. And in that regard, we left them in that gray zone I mentioned. And to speak with the 100-year-old Henry Kissinger, that was a recipe for instability. But it was all which was achievable at that summit. I mean, there was simply no more and no less either.
Mr. Secretary General, after a couple of months, Russia invaded Georgia. You remember that. What did this aggression against Georgia tell you about Russia as a state, about Vladimir Putin as the leader of the country?
Well, Putin had made it clear to me, going briefly back to Bucharest again, the morning after the compromise when I spoke to him, that this for him and for the Russian Federation was, of course, a totally unacceptable situation. So it was clear what he thought about it, and that came as no surprise to me. But the fact that he invaded Georgia in August 2008 is proof of the fact that apparently he considered the position taken by NATO in Bucharest as the green light. I mentioned the notion again to invade Georgia, and we can lengthen that line, that timeline, because 2008 was Georgia and 2014 was Crimea, the little green man occupation, and finally annexation of Crimea. So there is a straight line running from Bucharest till now. Now we are confronted with this Putin's horrible war of aggression in Ukraine.
And you remember, and you know, that after 2008, Russian officials are claiming that declaration of this, invitation to Ukraine and Georgia is actually one of the reasons that he invaded Ukraine. You did not give them membership action plan, but you promised that one day Kiev and Tbilisi would become members. So this is enough for Putin, they say, to launch this full-scale invasion of the country, of the European country. What would you answer?
That's the Russian narrative.
Absolutely,
and the Russian framing, which I can, of course, from my side, not accept, because it's simply untrue. And even if it were true, for the sake of argument, does that then justify the horrendous, horrible war of aggression Putin is waging against a sovereign state? And what Putin has done, by the way, he has created the solidarity within the North Atlantic Alliance, which wasn't there in Bucharest, and he has created Ukraine into a state, a nation where almost everybody hates Russia. So he has finally achieved what NATO did not achieve, but we should, of course, not following the Russian narrative and the framing by Moscow on the background of this war of aggression in Ukraine. That would go much too far. And the Russians, I can tell you, are at least underestimating my intelligence and our Western intellectual capabilities, so to speak.
So you have mentioned that you met Vladimir Putin. You know the guy. What is your impression on him? Because right now, the whole world is trying to calculate what he thinks about, what he's capable of. Is he really ready to push the button? You know what I mean? I mean, what do you think about him?
Well, as we all know, but let me give you my analysis, he is obsessed. It's not an ambition to reinstate the Russian Empire. It's an obsession. It's more than just an ambition. And in that regard, and that might surprise you and many other people, in that regard, he's a rational thinking politician. He's not a maverick. He's not an unguided missile. But this obsession can theoretically make him into a very dangerous leader. Because he is in the process of painting himself into a corner, and that rationality and that obsession might become, I should say, dangerous. Although, if you use the expression pushing the button, I consider the probability of pushing the nuclear button as extremely low. I add immediately not zero, but extremely low. Because for one, President Xi Jinping of China has made it abundantly clear to Vladimir Putin that he should really not be responsible for World War III, which would be, as we know, when nuclear weapons are used, a war which the globe and our planet might not survive. In other words, he is obsessed. And that obsession leads to the raping of Ukrainian women, the killing of tens of thousands of soldiers, of course, on the Ukrainian side, but also in the meat machine, in the grinder, where he sends his own young sons into battle. It is beyond imagination, but it is what's happening.
Going back to the history, despite of the war that Russia started right after this Bucharest Summit, the war in Georgia, there was no movement towards the enlargement of NATO, towards the invitation of post-Soviet states until now. And do you think that this soft deterrence, if I might call it that way, soft deterrence of Russia was the smart plan, smart strategy from the West towards Russia?
Well, I always answer these kind of questions with a rhetorical question, which I'll answer myself. And that is, what should or could NATO have done otherwise? When the Baltic states, you're in Riga, when the Baltic states with their history, when Poland with its history are knocking on the door, wanting freedom, wanting to join an alliance which guarantees freedom, the rule of law, and what have you. What would have been the alternative in those years? And let me add, and I have a transcript made by the Kremlin of my very first meeting with Vladimir Putin as a Dutch foreign minister in 2003, where he clearly states in the summary the Kremlin made of our conversation, not me, not the Dutch government, not NATO, that each and every nation should follow its own path. Of course, he was then not enthusiastic about NATO and EU enlargement for that matter. But I mean, his whole story, his obsession came back in 2007, 1 year before the Bucharest Summit, when, as you might remember, at the security conference in Munich, he started his Philippika against the West, against NATO expansion, and what have you. So, I mean, I have always fully supported and will support till the day I die that NATO expanded and that nations knocking on NATO door could become NATO members. That was why the Bucharest summit was so confusing and so unsatisfactory. Not that Ukraine would have been able to become a NATO member at the Bucharest summit, but again, the compromise was, in my opinion, the wrong compromise, and we should not now make the same mistake for the second time, where it concerns Ukraine and the European Union, because Ukraine, as we all know, is a candidate member of the European Union. European Union now should take that promise extremely seriously, as should Ukraine, by the way. And as far as NATO is concerned, everybody will understand, President Zelensky understands, that NATO membership now in a war condition is not in the offing. But I'm sure and I hope that the Vilnius Summit on 11 and 12 of July will result in very strong language by the West, by the transatlantic community vis-à-vis Ukraine.
During your terms as a Secretary General of NATO, the alliance welcomed 9 new members, if I'm not wrong. Russia was unhappy, has been unhappy, highly unhappy. Do you believe that this is actually one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin and his army invaded Ukraine, or this is just a myth?
Well, I think the Russians and President Putin more in particular are great experts in playing the victim. We are encircled. We are the victim of Western aggression. NATO made all kinds of promises NATO never made. But again, let's not forget that at the start of my mandate as NATO Secretary General on the 1st of January 2004, the atmosphere with the Russian delegation at NATO, I'm not going to say was all sun and no clouds, but was very manageable and very workable. And that deteriorated starting in 2007 and a bit before, when Vladimir Putin decided to nominate a new Russian NATO ambassador, Dmitry Rogozin. He's still active in Russia.
Oh, yes.
And when he came to visit me, he had a big present for me, a big package. And in that package was a huge axe. When I unpacked it,
oh my
and
God.
he said to me, I'll know it almost word by word, Mr. Secretary General. As you can see, I have come to bury the hatchet. Well, the contrary was true, because since then, the relationship between NATO and Russia deteriorated fundamentally and beyond repair, as we are now.
You have mentioned the Vilnius Summit. We are looking forward to it. I'm going to be there and covering, of course. What do you expect from this gathering of VIPs, except from the strong words that you have mentioned with the promises towards Ukraine? Why is this important?
Well, what I expect is of course, but you're mentioning quite rightly the language is a great political solidarity, which I would say is not so difficult given Putin's war of aggression and the war crimes and crimes against humanity he's committing as we speak. 2, I think that Ukraine should have a very specific trajectory to NATO without map. I think Ukraine doesn't need map anymore. Ukraine does need certain reforms, but I think NATO should go, the allies should go further. To give you an example, the NATO allies should make sure, not the alliance as such, but NATO allies, that for the long term, they commit themselves, also in a number of bilateral agreements, that Ukraine will have the best trained and most sophisticated army in Europe, so that the deterrence direction Vladimir Putin and Russia will never fail. And Putin will never, and his successors will never think again of attacking Ukraine. That is deterrence. Point number 3, there should be a special position for Ukraine in NATO in the framework of a NATO-Ukraine Council, like we had the NATO Russia Council, which means that Ukraine gets an embassy on the NATO compound in Brussels, and has a possibility of permanent political conversation with all the allies, will be invited at the table on a frequent basis. And then last but not least, what I do expect is a form of security guarantees or assurances. I mean, language matters here. The Americans rather speak about assurances, which, for instance, the United States of America has since many, many years with Israel, with its great ally Israel. Assurances that when the worst comes to the worst, the United States of America and the allies in NATO will also for the long term stand by Ukraine's side. Final point, not for the NATO summit in Vilnius, but very important. I repeat, let the European Union, for which Ukraine is a candidate member, not make the same mistake as NATO in 2008, promises on which they can't deliver. And let's see from the other part of Brussels, from the EU part of Brussels, that this candidacy is taken extremely seriously. It's a long process, it's a tedious process, but also here the message must be clear that Ukraine will become an EU member and that the chapters will be opened and that negotiations will start. With all the consequences that entails, I do realize, because when that happens with Ukraine, the nations in the Western Balkans will say, what about us? And that's also a question the EU has to answer. So it is, back to Vilnius, it is, in my opinion, a very substantial package on which the allies should agree. I mean, I'm giving you my personal opinion. I'm not privy to the conversations going on in the preparation of the final Vilnius communique.
You have mentioned assurances for Ukraine. There is a big, I would say, discussion, maybe even a fight about the post-war negotiations, post-war world. Even I would say there are people who think that there is no victory for any of the sides of the conflict. So, do you think that Ukraine can actually win this war, considering that the counteroffensive is going on?
Ukraine must win this war. Because if Ukraine doesn't win this war, it is the end of the Europe you and I have known. Because we're then entering a Europe where you can, without anything, play the aggressive card vis-à-vis other nations. Moldova will be the next victim. I talked about Vladimir Putin's obsession. What about Georgia, where the political situation is already so complicated that Georgia did not become a candidate EU member, which I regret in the sense that if you look at Georgia, the large majority of the Georgian people would like to be in the same boat as Ukraine, but it can't be done because the government make things impossible. In other words, we cannot and we should not ever allow that Europe to come about. So Ukraine must win this war. Under what conditions and under what circumstances is the responsibility of the Ukrainians under President Zelensky's leadership. I cannot, as a former Dutch minister or secretary general or whoever, like my successors, decide for Ukraine what should be a satisfactory end, what would winning that war and exactly mean. That's not up to me and not up to us.
Yeah, but the Western world would be inevitably the part of the post-war building process, right? Because, I mean, Russia must become a state which would be secure and safe for its neighbors, right? Because if it stops, I mean, if Ukraine wins the war, you still have a militarized country with a nuclear power as a neighbor. And Vladimir Putin is not guaranteed that Vladimir Putin will step down or he will leave his Kremlin castle and so on and so forth. What should we do with this?
Now, what we should do with this is that Ukraine, of course, is entering the special trajectory into NATO. That Ukraine will become a NATO member. I've just given you the pluses because we said this the same we said in Bucharest. Situation has changed. There's a war going on in Ukraine. Ukraine has been aggressively attacked by Putin. And Ukraine, in my opinion, will enter a special trajectory on the road to NATO. And before that trajectory has been finished, Deterrence should be built up, as I said, as one of my preferred results of the Vilnius Summit. Deterrence should be beefed up by the allies so that also short of NATO membership, no Russian president will ever think again of attacking Ukraine. And not the present president, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, might have the illusion that ever he will win this conflict. He will not, he should not, and he will not.
Thank you very much. This is the perfect ending of our conversation. I hope to see you again on TV Rain.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times. They got us on the 6th day of the war in Ukraine.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We left Russia, but we kept going. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia, the war, and Russian society in English as well.
Kherson is Putin's 3rd major defeat in a row.
What is wrong with the Russian army?
Stories no one else can tell you. Hear it right from the source. Subscribe to our channel.